This is a story that began more than 30 years ago, in 1987, would you believe, when I set off on a 6-month journey along the Silk Road to write this book. I'll put some more details at the end. And I live in Winchester, which is not far from Whitchurch, so what better place to start a journey along the Silk Road than Whitchurch Silk Mill? The manager at that time was Bill Carr, and when he heard my story, he set me a riddle to solve. And the riddle was that he knew that Whitchurch got its silk ready spun via an agent, but originally from China, but he didn't know where in China that silk was spun. So he said that if I could find out where Whitchurch silk was spun, he wrote me a message of greetings to give to them, and that was my instruction for the next 6 months from Bill Carr. It was a great journey, but for political reasons I had to miss out most of the Middle East and Afghanistan, and so more than 20 years later I went back to try and fill in the missing link, and did a great journey through the Middle East, another 6-month journey, but again for political reasons I couldn't carry on to Afghanistan. So a couple of years after that, in 2011, I decided to approach the whole thing from a completely different direction, starting in the Caucasus, crossing the Caspian Sea and dropping down into Afghanistan from the north. A journey that became quite convoluted in the end, but I did succeed in filling in all my missing links. So I started in the Caucasus, which is a fabulous range of mountains. I just can't tell you, where Russia, Georgia and Azerbaijan all come together, and the people lead such isolated lives. These villages are often cut off by snow from the rest of the world for up to 3 months in every year. But if you go in springtime, as I did, that's when nature is coming alive, and the farming families are taking their sheep and goats and cattle up to the high pastures, where they will stay all summer long. The Georgians are mostly Christians, and the people of Azerbaijan are mostly Muslims. But best of all, I discovered I was back on the Silk Road. This was the northern branch of the Silk Road, taken by Marco Polo on his return journey from China. And so it was a great opportunity to see that as well as my original one. And Azerbaijan is still producing silk today. There is the small silk mill in the town of Sheki in the mountains of Azerbaijan. A bit unprepossessing, don't you think, on the outside. And the inside, well, I'm afraid they wouldn't let me in. They were very suspicious of me. I think they thought I was some kind of industrial spy. But they were kind enough to give me a photo. And so I can show you that despite what it looked like on the outside, inside you see a really quite sophisticated production facility. But it does rain a lot. It does rain a lot in the Caucasus, so I wasn't too upset when I had to carry on my journey and go down, down, down to the Caspian Sea. Now, time is really short today, so I'm going to whiz you across the Caspian, across the Karakum Desert, to the city of Kiva. Can you see it on the map there? Kiva. Today it's in Uzbekistan, but it goes back for hundreds of years as a Silk Road caravanserai. A caravanserai, as you know, is a stopping place, a staging post for caravans. But there was one problem in the deserts of the Karakum. It's quite difficult to find a city that's built mostly of sand and mud, sand-coloured city in a sand-coloured desert, and many of the caravans failed to find it. unbelievable. But when you think there was no GPS in those days, not even compasses, and so to help them focus in, the king of Kiva in the 18th century built this enormous minaret. It's like a lighthouse, but without the lights. And that restored Kiva's position as a prime Silk Road caravanserai, and no more camel caravans got lost. I loved Kiva. I loved poking my nose into corners and through doorways, and some of the doors in the doorways are actually very special to this city, because you see the intricate carvings. These tell in pictorial form the story of the history of Kiva, if you know how to interpret it. And it was through one of these doorways that I found Kiva's best kept secret, the Kiva Silk Carpet Weaving Workshop. It's in an old building, but the workshop, when I visited, had only been going for about 20 years. It was a cooperative of about 50 women, all women, highly skilled in silk weaving, and they had formed this cooperative to give them an opportunity to make an independent life for themselves, which in Uzbekistan in the 2000s was really very difficult indeed. They are very skilled. After many of them have been doing this for 20 years, and they base some of the carpet designs. See the design she's working to down at the bottom here on those old doors. And so these carpets also, in a funny sort of way, tell the story of the history of Kiva. It takes a team of 4 women, usually a month or so, to make a carpet, and so, as you can expect, they go for a very high price, and most local people can't afford them. In fact, they're mostly exported to America and all over the world, which is a bit of a shame, but I like to think of the story of Kiva being transported to the 4 corners of the world. But the best thing is, the Kiva Silk Carpet Weaving Workshop uses local Kiva silk, because in the surrounding desert there are irrigated silk farms. I say farms, they're actually orchards of the white mulberry tree, the leaf of which is what the silkworm eats. And so they raise these silkworms, they take the cocoons, can you see the cocoons here? And if you unravel one of those cocoons, it will make a single thread of fine silk, more than 1 kilometre in length. Here is the raw silk, and after it's been cleaned and tidied up, this is the refined silk. And they use local natural dyes to produce the colours for the carpets, and these are very characteristic. They're pastel shades, and to make, shall we take an example, to make yellow, top left hand corner, you use, guess what, onion skin. If you want a sort of deeper, sort of yellowy brown, pomegranate's the thing to go for. Bottom right here, if you want orange silk, you use madder root. And if you want bright blue silk, you use indigo. But if you want to turn the white silk black, you have to use something called zoc. And I asked them what zoc was, and I never got a satisfactory reply. You can look it up on Wikipedia. It's a sort of alkaline calcium substance, which is very rare. It's actually, in this region of the world, it's only found in Afghanistan. And so periodically, the women of the silk carpet mill a carpet weaving workshop, have to send a man to Afghanistan to get more zog. So I thought it would be a good idea to go to Afghanistan, where the zog comes from. And we're going to skip a lot of the trip here because time is short, but if you look at the map, this is Afghanistan. It's huge. Did you know Afghanistan is 4 times the size of the UK? And if you look carefully at the map, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, it has a sort of extension of territory, a panhandle, if you like, pointing eastwards towards China. To its north is Tajikistan, originally the Soviet Union, of course, and to its south, Pakistan. And that panhandle, that extension, is called the Wakan Corridor. And there it is. Wow. This isn't my photo. It isn't even a real photo at all. It's a computer-generated image. But it's very accurate, actually. We are floating 30,000 feet above the gateway to the Wakan, looking east, and the corridor stretches for 250 miles away from us. In the far distance, 400 miles away, you see Mount Kongur in China. This great rift valley to the left is the valley of the Amu Darya, which we Europeans have always called the Oxus, the greatest river in the whole of Central Asia. And in fact, that river at this point forms the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And there it is, the border. Afghanistan on the right, Tajikistan on the left. And when I crossed that border, it was like stepping back 100 years. On the Tajik side, everything was neat and tidy. There were cars, electric lights, clean, fresh drinking water out of a tap, and central heating. On the Afghan side, there were donkeys, lighting was by candles, water came in buckets, and heating was by smoky yak dung fires. Actually, the first thing I saw when I entered Afghanistan was this, because this was the border across which the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and across which they retreated 10 years later in confusion and disarray and defeat, a defeat which led indirectly to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second thing I saw was this, a reminder that Afghanistan is still a very traditional society, but not too traditional, because these 2 young women who were walking up the track as I was walking down it, as they passed me, they both turned to me and said, "Hello," in English. Very friendly. I was heading for the small town of Ishkashim, which is the sort of gateway town to the corridor. And if you want to spend a month in the Wakan Corridor, as I did, it is in the bazaar of Ishkashim that you will get your supplies. This is the bazaar. I took the picture early in the morning before the shops had opened. Here are the shops along the right here, and when they did open, I was relieved to find them well stocked. And I do mean relieved, because even with the internet, it was impossible to find out really what I was going to encounter when I crossed that border. And I did need supplies. You can imagine a month up there in the Wakan without any likelihood of being able to get anything other than well, we'll see what the locals eat in a minute. So I stocked up with whatever I could find, and the next thing I needed was someone to act as a sort of guide and fixer. I usually do these travels on my own. I mean, I prefer to do that, but you can't in Afghanistan. It's not allowed, and it would be impossible anyway. So I was really lucky on the second day in Kashim to meet Ya Muhammad. Yar Muhammad found me, actually. I think word had got around. And he marched up to me in the bazaar, pushed through the crowd and said, "I am your interpreter and guide." It was a statement. And that is what he became. As an interpreter, he was absolutely priceless, because I don't speak the two languages of the Wakan Corridor. The languages are Waki and Kyrgyz, and I don't speak either of those. As a guide, he wasn't actually that much good, because it turned out he'd never been there. But never mind, it was thanks to Yar Muhammad that I found the other thing that I needed, which was transport for me and for the baggage, the supplies. Many people in Afghanistan prefer other animals as pack animals. I've always preferred horses. I prefer riding them. I prefer using them. They're much more reliable. But historically, sorry about that. I'll come to that in a moment. Turns out that every time you hire a horse in Afghanistan, you get a horseman for free. Well, not for free. You pay for the horseman and the horse together. So let me introduce you to my two fantastic horsemen, Shogun and Amin Bek. I had two horses, so two horsemen. Shogun first. He was a real joker, and not just on us. He played jokes on everybody we met. But when there were rivers to be crossed, it was always Shogun who was first into the icy water to make sure that we crossed the river safely. I mean, Beck was a much more gentle character. You can see it in his eyes, can't you? And it was always Beck, first thing in the morning, who brought me a mug of tea in my sleeping bag. I've never forgotten that. He was a real sweetie pie. But back to the animals. Traditionally, people in this region, many of them use yaks for transport, and a yak has many uses, as we'll see later, and can carry actually more weight than a horse. It can carry 70 kilos with no trouble at all. It's a docile creature. It will just stand there waiting while you load it up, not complaining, and then it'll just stand there while you try and get it to move, and it will carry on standing there. Kick it, or you could do whatever you like, but it will carry on standing there until the yak is ready to move. The other very popular pack animal over the years has been the Bacterium Camel. Now, a Bacterium Camel is not like the camels that we're used to, which are hot weather camels. This is a cold weather camel, and apart from the two humps, it's distinguished by this long fleece of wool, which in winter, of course, becomes even thicker and enables the camel to survive temperatures which up here in the Pamir Mountains can easily go down to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Marco Polo used a train of Bactrian camels on his journeys to China and back again, and so I did the same for part of my journey too. And I was in paradise, because for the first time on all my trips I didn't have to carry everything. The horses, in my case horses of course, were doing all the hard work, and at first they were quite heavily laden. You can imagine when you're taking supplies for 3 people for a month in the wilderness, there's quite a lot of stuff. But as the journey progressed, and especially on the return journey, the load became lighter and lighter, and I was even able to ride one of the horses, which was an added bonus. I love this picture with Shogun and Amin Bek both looking like criminals, which is what they did look like most of the time, but of course they weren't at all, and I couldn't have done the journey without them. Sometimes the river, remember the river? The river Amu Darya narrowed. Sometimes the valley opened right out, and at other times it narrowed right down, and the river was white water in a deep gorge. And there were other rivers to cross, because of course in the headwaters of this river system there are many tributaries, some of which are substantial rivers in their own right. I always got very worried when I was crossing these rickety bridges, and I tried to look confident, but the truth is I wasn't at all confident. My knees were shaking. But most of the time there weren't any bridges at all, and we had to wade across the cold water. It was August. I'd timed the whole trip to spend the month of August up here, because at altitudes of up to more than 4,000 metres, it's the only month really when you can be sure it's not going to snow. In June, July, the meltwaters are still coming down from the snowfields above, and the rivers run high. But in August, by August, they're getting lower and lower, and so it is feasible to cross those rivers safely. And do you remember I mentioned that Shogun was always the first one into the icy water to make sure that the rest of us got across. For every crossing that I made, Shogun made 3. First with the horses laden, then bringing the horses back again without any luggage, so that Yar Mohammed and I could cross without getting our feet wet. Shogun was an absolute gem. Of course, historically, people have always helped each other in the Pamir Mountains and all along the Silk Road. In fact, Marco Polo wrote in his book, which he wrote after his return to Venice, that when a traveller meets another traveller in trouble, he will halt his journey until such time as his fellow traveller is safely on his way. And that principle still stands today, and you often see it in practice. What about the people? Well, there aren't many people in the Wakan Corridor, only 230 families, I think I was told, but they fall into 2 groups, the Waki and the Kyrgyz. The Waki stay in the same valley all their lives, and they live in simple stone houses like this. But the Kyrgyz are semi-nomadic. They go up in the summer, down in the winter. They're always looking for new green pastures for their animals, and so they live in portable tents, which they call yurts. These are circular tents covered in felt, and very well insulated and very warm in winter. For travellers, whether it's the stone huts of the Waki or the tents of the Kyrgyz, there is always a warm greeting, and the first thing they give you is yogurt. But don't think supermarket yogurt. This is fresh yak's milk yogurt. It's tangy, it sort of fizzes on the tongue, and it is very addictive. Full of vitamins, of course, as well. So after a long day's walk, we all tucked into the yak's milk yogurt. Well, of course, yak's milk yogurt comes from yaks, and it's the job of the girls and the young women to go out twice a day to milk the yaks. Do you remember I said earlier that this yak is a very useful creature? I'm not a great fan of the yak as a pack animal, but blimey, I love their yogurt. And some of it, of course, is sheep's milk, because they keep sheep and goats as well, and it's the younger girls, the teenage girls, whose job it is to milk the sheep and goats. So some of that yak's milk is actually mixed with sheep and goats. And there it is. And together with flat barley bread, this forms the bulk of the diet of the Kyrgyz and the Waki up here in the Wakan Corridor. I found it really strange because, we're always being told to eat our 5 vegetables a day, aren't we? Never saw a single vegetable or fruit in the whole month that I was there. And you know, that was August. If there had been, I would have seen them. Somehow they get all the minerals and vitamins they need from what you see here. In fact, further east you'll find that if you go to Tibet, the Tibetans do exactly the same. And when I say that this is sort of the sum total of their diet, I'm not quite telling the truth, because they also drink lots of tea. Now, I love tea. I'm English after all. I like my tea at the end of a long day's walk. But beware, this isn't tea as we know it, with milk and sugar. This is yak butter tea. And it is made with salt, and floating on the top, a lovely globule of rancid yak butter. Ugh. Most foreigners I've met say they've thrown up at the first taste. I grew to quite like it, but you have to be a little bit careful when you're offered bowls of rancid yak butter tea, because if you empty your bowl, they'll just fill it up again. And so be warned if you find yourself drinking rancid yak butter tea. But how is the food cooked? How is the bread baked? How is the tea boiled? What kind of fuel is used? Because there are no trees in the Wakan. Well, the answer, of course, is, yep, you've guessed it, yak dung. I told you these yaks were useful. And again, it's the job of the young women each morning to go out and pick up the night's droppings. Why is it always the women who have to do this? And collecting the night's droppings, they pack them out and lay them in the sun to dry. And you see the lovely moist yak dung all over her hands. And then she went off and made lunch for everybody, so that was nice. But joking apart, yak dung is one of the most vital parts of the Kyrgyz and the Waki people's lives. That which isn't used immediately, day by day, is dried and stored. And this is essential because when winter comes, they will need much more fuel, not just for cooking, but for heating the yurt, the tent, or the little stone houses. Because as I mentioned, the temperature in winter can go down to 50 degrees below Celsius. And so each summer, a supply of dried yak dung is built up, and without that supply, the family might not survive. And so, like Marco Polo, I reached China. And on my third trip, the one where I travelled through Afghanistan, I made a long circuit of this great empty area you see here. The westernmost part of China is a desert called the Taklamakan. It means, in the Uyghur language, it means go in and you won't come out. And so sensible travellers have always gone around the Taklamakan. Marco Polo went to the south, and I did as well. In fact, I tried to follow that southerly route on my first trip in 1987, but I got arrested. So on the latest trip, and the final one in 2011, I tried again, and it was I was curious to see whether I would make it this time. This Taklamakan is not like the Sahara. It's a cold desert. I mentioned the temperatures in winter, but it can really, it's really not what we imagine as a sort of normal desert at all, apart from the sand dunes. I was there in September, when the temperature was just about right. And the people who live in this westernmost part of China are called the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs, when I first visited them, were a much neglected people. like all the minority people in China, they had their towns had no electricity, there were no schools. The Chinese really just ignored them. And on my second visit, I discovered that, oh, incidentally, can you see what's happening here? Just to illustrate that there were no schools, this is the professional letter writer in this town, writing a letter for this lady, and if she receives a reply, of course, she will take it to him to read to her. And so that is his full-time job, or was, in 1987. On my second visit, I was glad to see that things had improved. There was electricity, there were schools, and the position of the Uyghurs seemed much better. But on my third visit, it had deteriorated very badly. And the reason for that was that the real problem in the eyes of the Chinese authorities was that of course the Uyghurs were Muslim, and the Chinese became more and more terrified that they would rise up and threaten the Chinese state. In fact, I don't think they ever would. There were occasional disturbances, but that was more to sort of in protest at the Chinese crackdown than anything more general than that. But the plight of the Uyghurs now is really serious, as I'm sure you know. They are in the news all the time for all the wrong reasons, which is a great shame, because the Uyghurs have a heritage of architecture and culture that goes back for 100 years. And on my earlier visits, you know, that was still prospering. I'm afraid no longer. The western part of China is vital to the country. It has oil, it has coal, and it has two rather nasty materials called asbestos and lithium. Well, we know about asbestos. Lithium, of course, is a relatively newfound mineral. It's not bad in itself, but to make those lithium batteries involves some dangerous processing. And although we need lithium batteries, and we're going to need more and more of them in future, I wouldn't like to live in this place, would you? On my first trip, I had carried on east, and so on my second trip, I visited one place that had remained in my mind all those more than 20 years, and that was the Great Wall of China, and particularly a place on the Great Wall called Jiayuguan, the Great Gate under Heaven, or the greatest gate under heaven. For hundreds of years, travellers on the Silk Road have passed through this gate, Chinese traders going west, and European traders like Marco Polo going east. For all of them, this archway was a symbolic place, which was perhaps why it had a great historic pagoda built over it. That was a photo I took back in 1987. I thought it was a historic pagoda, but then I peeked around the corner and found another historic pagoda under construction. What was going on here? Well, what was going on, of course, was that all China's historic buildings were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution back in the 1960s and 70s. And it was only in the 1980s that the country started rebuilding those important things from history, and they rebuilt them to exactly the same design as if they had never been demolished. You can see the design of that one is identical to that, and if we fast forward for 20 years, that's the same scene today. You would never guess, would you, that they hadn't been there all along. Well, most visitors wouldn't, but have a look at this. Can you see it here? This doorway. It's a double doorway in the first of the pagodas that I showed earlier. And if we go up to it, you'll see that in 1987 it had been vandalised by the Red Guards under Chairman Mao. But by 2011, look, it had all been restored, and it was just as if the Cultural Revolution had never happened. Marco Polo finished his eastbound journey in the town of Suzhou, and by a coincidence, I made a beeline for Beijing and did some research, and by coincidence found that Whitchurch Silk was actually spun in the town of Suzhou. Suzhou is a historic place, and Marco Polo was so impressed by it that he called it the Venice of the East. And you can sort of see why, can't you? And but the key thing for me was Suzhou #1 Silk Mill. It only has one silk mill, so it's a good name. And Suzhou #1 Silk Mill turned out to be the place where Whitchurch silk was spun. So I went in and I sort of chatted a bit. I don't speak Chinese, but I chatted a bit in English to the manager and passed him the piece of paper from Bill Carr, which I'd had translated into Chinese. And he scurried off into his office, and I was left alone to wander around the mill. Nobody stopped me. It was great, really. And so I could sort of see the workers here taking the silk cocoons and putting them into boiling water, which kills the silkworm and dissolves the resin, and then putting it into cold water and picking out each cocoon one by one and threading the yarn off onto these bobbins above. The bobbins were actually mechanically operated, and they were going like the clappers. Then the manager came out, and he was followed by what seemed to be sort of half a dozen under managers. The entire senior staff of the silk mill marched up to me, and I thought, oh, I'm in big trouble. But he handed me another piece of paper with some writing in Chinese, and when I had it translated, it said, "The staff of Suzhou #1 send greetings to their comrades at Whitchurch and wish them success in meeting their targets for the coming year." And that greeting, translated into English, was displayed in the visitor centre for many years afterwards, until it got lost. But you can read about it and all the other things in the book I wrote, an adventure on the old Silk Road, and if you want to get hold of it, you can buy it online. Oh, there's Bill Carr again. We've come full circle, haven't we? But from start to finish, you can buy the book online. Best place to go is my website for this and lots of other stories, and the address is pilk.net. Thank you very much for watching.